According to leaked reports published in the New York Times, Vladimir Putin is quietly signaling to the West that he might be ready to tap out. But is this just another Russian propaganda trick, or is Putin really ready to make peace in Ukraine? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's get right into it. Okay, first, hope you guys are having a Merry Christmas, at least here in the West and in Ukraine, actually. Ukraine changed the official date of their Christmas to align with the West and to kind of distance themselves from the Russian Orthodox Church that by actually most accounts has been corrupted or coerced to support this Russian aggression in Ukraine. But that's an aside. The important thing to take away today is that according to the New York Times, and they are citing senior Russian, U.S., and other international officials, President Vladimir Putin has been quietly using back channels and intermediaries to signal his interest in a ceasefire, despite the fact that Putin's public statements are actually more bombastic than they've been in almost 2 years, right? Publicly, you may recall, Putin has made his official stance that he wants to essentially turn Ukraine into a puppet state, to what he calls demilitarize, which is generally code for defeat the military entirely of Ukraine. A word I can't say on YouTube without getting demonetized, but it's code for change the political alignment of the entire country to reflect a pro-Russian or pro-Moscow stance, and in all likelihood, extract a concession from NATO that Ukraine will never be a member, which of course would involve NATO going back on a policy they've had for at least 50 years. So the reason I point that out is because Putin has made his stances very clear. And as the war went worse for him, his rhetoric sort of softened. It became more about resisting the West in like vague terms. But now, of course, that Russia is on the offense, Putin is once again returned to his old rhetoric in public. So it's very significant that in private, he has a very different narrative, allegedly. Because since at least September, Putin has been expressing his interest in a ceasefire, but he has conditions. And that is that the current front lines be essentially frozen, which would mean for Ukraine officially yielding almost 20% of its sovereign territory to Russia, relinquishing its claims on Crimea and on the Donbas, as well as essentially accepting on some level that Kharkiv, Luhansk, Donetsk, and Zaporizhzhia are all now Russian sovereign territory, essentially. Now, the reason there's two explanations for this, but the most likely is that simply Putin realizes he cannot sustain this fight forever. And politically, it has become a really, really hot button issue for him. There's only so many of his citizens he can get killed or maimed in Ukraine before it becomes a political liability. Yes, Putin will not get voted out of office because he doesn't run a democracy, but popular uprisings happen to dictators all the time. And frankly, there's always someone who would be happy to be the next Putin. Prigozhin is one prominent example. So Putin wants to ensure that at least his public supports him. And to do that, right, he cannot afford to continue to lose hundreds of thousands of people in Ukraine. Remember, bear in mind, guys, this is the size of all of Russia, right? Like all of Russia is absolutely massive. And you can see that they're fighting. They're losing like a generation of men, essentially, to fight over an industrial sliver of Ukraine as well as Crimea. And don't get me wrong, Crimea, geopolitically significant. Eastern Ukraine has some heavy industry, but it's not really like overwhelmingly power. It's not an overwhelming economic hub that Moscow absolutely needs to ensure Russia's survival, right? And so Putin, I think, has pretty quickly realized that he's got to find a way out of this thing. And so he is saying, hey, listen, if you just let us hold what we've taken, we'll call it even. But of course, if you're Ukraine, you're like, no, we were a sovereign country at the start. And if you are so desperate to end the war, then just go home. Just pack your bags and leave. And that's a really fair point. So do I think this is a deception by Russia? I actually don't. I think Putin is indeed in a way tighter bind than he is publicly portraying, and then even the West appreciates. I think the fact that there's a bunch of wings within democratically elected governments in many Western countries, but prominently in the United States, the Republican Party has become very, very skeptical of Ukraine aid and has effectively blocked it. And I think this is part of Putin's strategy. They actually acknowledge that part of the reason Putin may be pushing for this ceasefire, because it would benefit Russia, right? And they also acknowledge that it could be a temporary ceasefire, and that this would allow Russia time to recruit more troops, to prepare and train them better, and then resume aggression with a much more powerful military. The other thing that Putin would benefit from is the fact that, one, he believes that the West is focused more heavily on the Israel conflict. He knows it is an election year for the U.S. president, as it's an election year for himself. But again, he is going to win the election. But he knows that the counterparty in the United States may want to achieve they may want to use the war and the war's resolution to achieve their own political aims. If this war looks like a liability, for example, for President Biden, he may want to sign some kind of ceasefire before Americans go to the polls. And in contrast, right, the Republican Party may actually, if there's a Republican president, he may want to take office and be able to say, oh, look, I ended the Ukraine war. So Putin is going to try to take advantage of that, the distraction with Israel, and the domestic issues at home in general in the West to try to sneak in a ceasefire. The problem is, of course, that while the West can make recommendations, just like with the counteroffensive, in the West, right, Ukraine is not a puppet state. We could change our level of support for Ukraine, and we could recommend to them that they do take one action or another. But ultimately, the only person who can negotiate a ceasefire in Ukraine is the Ukrainian government. And that Ukrainian government has had very, very little appetite from what we've seen for a significantly abandoning its territory in order to achieve peace. We know that Ukraine, for example, is starting to look at mobilizing men who fled the country. They are starting to pivot tactics to use technology like drones to inflict casualties while maintaining a high level of standoff distance. They're looking at fighting the war efficiently, and they're preparing very actively to do so. And so I think that for Putin, he believes that this is a possibility, but ultimately, I don't think it's going to happen. Right? It's unrealistic for him to think that Ukraine will just sign away their territory. Guys, if you are going through the holidays, you're probably already thinking like me about your New Year's resolution, and you're probably going to need some energy to make it through and achieve your New Year's goals. That's why I created Strike Gum. Strike Gum is the gum that is an energy drink alternative, right? When you have an energy drink, they're, dozens, like 40 or 50 grams of sugar. Strike Gum, 0 sugar, 90 milligrams of caffeine in every piece, and 100 milligrams of alpha GPC, right, in each individual piece. Best of all, of course, an entire pack, $5.99 versus $4 for an energy drink. So it's such a better deal, right? Each piece works out to like 90 cents if you get the tray. And right now, until January 5th, we have a huge sale. Free shipping on all orders over $70 in the US and orders over $100 internationally. So if you were waiting to try Strike Gum, especially if you're a serious caffeine head, now is the time to pick up a tray and check out your Strike Gum. Plus, 50% of the profits from this first production run are going to be donated to charities that support Ukrainian civilians who've been injured or displaced in the conflict. But we literally just put in our order for our second production run. So, get it now, get that contribution, because, unexpectedly, we have sold a ton more gum than I liked. But it's obvious. It's because people really like it and because $4 for an energy drink is a ripoff. Anyway, that's pretty much all I had for today, guys. The only other thing I want to point out that I thought was sort of interesting is in the combat map, and just a small aside, that Russian offensive actions down about 30% in the last 24 hours. So sometimes this is the natural ebb and flow of Russian forces, but again, it's very possible that this reflects a sort of slowing of Russian momentum. And remember, when it comes to political statements like Putin's desire for a ceasefire, he's going to clamor louder for that when his troops are achieving battlefield success. So the worse they perform in the battlefield, the more likely Putin is going to either reduce his demands, right, because it looks like he's losing anyway, or simply quiet his desires to try to extract such massive concessions from Ukraine in a peace deal. Anyway, guys, that is all I had. Thank you so much, of course. And be sure to hit like and subscribe on the channel. Let the YouTube algorithm know I'm making good content. That's all I had. Thank you guys so much. And I will see you all in the next one. Cheers.